So friends, with the release of some of these January 6th committee transcripts, guess what's back in the news? Donald Trump and Jared Kushner's criminal responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kushner here. So friends, going through some of the J6 committee transcripts that were recently released, we see another issue coming back into focus. That issue is the criminally negligent handling of the coronavirus pandemic by the Trump administration, specifically by Donald Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. I wish this had never left the news, because this is about as unforgivable as it gets. You know, the conduct of the Trump administration was more befitting of North Korea or Russia, where they sort of overtly don't care about the health and well-being of their own people. So friends, let's have a look at a transcript that was just released by the January 6th committee of the testimony of a former White House Director of Strategic Communications, a woman by the name of Alyssa Farah Griffin. And she was asked some questions about the first meeting of the coronavirus task force that was being headed up, the meeting by Jared Kushner, the first meeting after Biden had won the election. So now all of these matters concerning the government's response to the coronavirus pandemic would now be transitioning over to the Biden administration. Here is a little clip of the testimony of Alyssa Farah Griffin. It was the first COVID-like morning meeting that Jared led after that had been announced, Biden's win. And Dr. Bricks raised, she said, well, should we be looping the Biden transition into these conversations? And Jared just said, absolutely not. And then we just moved on. So that was Jared Kushner making sure that there would not be a smooth, safe, informed transition of a topic that was critically important to the health and well-being of the American people, the government's response to a deadly pandemic that was killing hundreds of thousands of Americans. Jared Kushner did not want a smooth, informed transition to the Biden administration. So friends, this brings me back to a topic that I've talked about before, but not for quite some time. Trump and Kushner and Pence's responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths. So we're going to go to Team Justice Law School. This is going to feel a little like a Crim Law 101 class, but I want to try to keep it simple and targeted. So friends, let's talk about the different kinds of homicide, the different degrees of murder. Different jurisdictions call them different things, but generally speaking, you're probably familiar with first-degree murder, premeditated murder, an intentional killing with malice aforethought. Then there's second-degree murder. There is voluntary manslaughter. There's involuntary manslaughter. Some jurisdictions have negligent homicide. I want to talk about the avoidable COVID deaths that were caused, I use that word advisedly, please put a pin in it, that were caused by Trump and Kushner and Pence. I include Pence because he, for an extended period of time, was the head of the coronavirus task force, and he let Donald Trump lie to the American people and endanger us all. So yes, he is also culpably responsible for avoidable COVID deaths. I'm going to use the laws of the District of Columbia for purposes of our discussion today, but recognize there were avoidable COVID deaths in all 50 states and in the territories. So frankly, this applies equally, across the United States. And I sure wish that some homicide prosecutors in one or more states would be presenting evidence to the grand jury to see if the grand jury believed there was enough evidence to charge Trump, Kushner, and Pence for these avoidable COVID deaths. But I'm going to talk specifically about the crime of involuntary manslaughter under the laws of the District of Columbia, because I think that is sort of where I see criminal liability settling out. Involuntary manslaughter. What does that mean? In order to prove somebody is criminally responsible for the death of another under the charge of involuntary manslaughter, there are three things that a prosecutor would have to prove in the courts of D.C. Three elements, three facts before you could hold somebody accountable for involuntary manslaughter. The first element is that somebody acted in a grossly negligent way, and it ultimately resulted in the death of another. But that's element number one. Somebody was grossly negligent, or somebody had a duty to act and they failed in that duty. And that failure was a product of gross negligence. Donald Trump had a duty to act. Why? He took an oath of office to faithfully execute the laws of the country, to support and defend the Constitution, and he has a duty to protect the American people. And he failed in that duty, and that failure was a product of not just his gross negligence. I believe it was intentional, though intentional misconduct is not required to prove somebody committed the crime of involuntary manslaughter. I told you this was going to be like a Crim Law 101 class, friends. First element, somebody acted in a grossly negligent way. Second element, their grossly negligent conduct was reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury of another. In other words, Trump's gross negligence put people in harm's way. And we're going to talk about precisely how he did that in a moment. But that's the second element. And the third element is that Trump's grossly negligent conduct caused the death of another. Here is why I asked you to put a pin in the idea of causation. People might say, well, you can't prove Donald Trump caused any of these deaths. You know, he didn't shoot anybody, he didn't stab anybody, he didn't strangle anybody, and that's what we typically think of when we think of a defendant causing the death of a victim. That's not how the law defines causation. The law defines causation as somebody's conduct being a substantial factor in bringing about the death of another. And I'm going to give you a concrete example of that again in a minute. Let's go back to the three elements now. One, grossly negligent conduct. Well, let's talk about Donald Trump lying to the American people about the coronavirus. By his own admission, he told Bob Woodward in private conversations that were recorded, oh, I was always downplaying the danger. I wasn't going to tell the American people the truth about how deadly it was, how easily transmitted it was, how the American people could simply protect themselves and protect others by wearing masks. No, no, no. I was always going to downplay it. In fact, I was telling them things like, it'll go away like a miracle. 15 cases will soon be 0. The warm weather will kill it, and you know what? If it doesn't, you can inject bleach. So Donald Trump clearly was grossly negligent. In fact, he was intentionally engaged in misconduct and misdirection, but he was clearly grossly negligent in the way he lied to the American people. Here is a shining example of that. Recall when Donald Trump mocked a reporter, a White House reporter by the name of Jeff Mason, for wearing a mask. Even though the CDC was recommending masks to protect yourself and others and to prevent the transmission of the disease. Remember this reporting? Trump mocks reporter who rejects his order to remove face mask. Oh, you want to be politically correct. Friends, think about it. What message was Donald Trump sending the people of the United States? If you wear a mask to protect yourself and others, You're worthy of being mocked and demeaned. By whom? By the President of the United States. Don't you think people seeing that, hearing that, absorbing that, were making their own life decisions and behavioral decisions based on the message being sent by the president? If you wear a mask, you're wrong, you're stupid, you're worthy of being mocked and demeaned. You know, somebody might think, well, I don't want to be politically correct. I don't want to be mocked, including by the President of the United States, for wearing a mask. I'm not wearing a mask. I guess it's not necessary. Yeah, Donald Trump was grossly negligent in the way he mismanaged the message and the coronavirus pandemic. And friends, before we move on to the next element, let's take on Jared Kushner's grossly negligent conduct, and actually so much worse. It was beyond grossly negligent. It was beyond reckless. It was intentional. Intentionally endangering the American people. Remember this reporting? This from the Business Insider. Kushner's coronavirus team shied away from a national strategy, believing that the virus was hitting Democratic states hardest and that they could blame governors, report says. Remember that? Jared Kushner saying, you know what? Let's just let it run rampant because it seems to be killing more folk in the blue states than in the red states. Is that grossly negligent conduct? And then moving on to the second element that's likely to result in death or serious bodily injury to another, that's likely to put people in harm's way, you bet it is. Trump's conduct, Kushner's conduct, and Mike Pence's conduct as head of the coronavirus task force, just sitting back and letting these lies and this dangerous recklessness regarding policy go unaddressed, unchecked, uncorrected. That is Pence's sin and gross negligence. Now, let's move on to the final element, right? Second element, likely to put people in harm's way, check. Third element, their gross negligence thereby caused the death of others. People might say, well, wait a minute. Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, Mike Pence didn't really kill anybody directly. They didn't stab anybody, shoot anybody, strangle anybody. How can you say they caused the death of another? Here's where the law comes in and helps. Because the word causation, the legal concept of causation, has a specific definition in the law. Doesn't mean you shot, stabbed, or strangled somebody. It means that your conduct, for purposes of involuntary manslaughter, your grossly negligent conduct, was a substantial factor in bringing about the death of another. So friends, let me use a concrete example to illustrate the concept of causation in the law. We had a case in D.C. that I supervised when I was chief of homicide at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, where a robber was attempting to rob a victim, and the victim ran. He was trying to avoid being robbed. He ran between two parked cars and he darted out into the street, and he was struck by a car and he was killed. Now, you might say, well, the robber didn't kill him. The robber wasn't driving the car that struck and killed the victim. No, but the robber's conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the death, and that robber was convicted not only of attempted robbery, but of murder, of a particular level of homicide, because he caused the death. His conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about the death, just as Trump and Kushner and Pence's conduct were substantial factors in bringing about the death of others, in creating avoidable COVID deaths. They, figuratively speaking, ran us all out into a deadly oncoming pandemic by lying to us about the nature and the danger and the transmissibility and the ease of preventing transmission by wearing masks. In fact, Trump mocked people who wore masks. So friends, that is why I say, taken as a whole, all of this evidence proves that Trump, Kushner, and Pence have criminal responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths. About that, I have no doubt. And the only way we will see if a jury agrees with that is if some brave, strong, determined prosecutor brings the case and puts it before 12 people in a jury box sitting as the conscience of the community. I think the American people deserve that. I think the 1.1 million people who were taken from us via the coronavirus deserve that. And goodness knows the family members and the friends and the loved ones and the community members of those 1.1 million Americans deserve that. Because justice matters. Friends, I told you that was going to feel like a Team Justice Law School class. Thank you for sticking with me. Please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.